Well, welcome everybody. We are glad you are joining us. We are expecting some more folks here, so we'll kind of get started slowly. But this is a networking forum sponsored by the Florida Horticulture for Health Network. We're a somewhat new organization. Leslie, we've been in place for about a year plus now. And if this is the first contact you've had with us, we have a fantastic website that's all free. It's got some really wonderful resources. We call it our resource hub, lots of research and videos and different kinds of programs around. And one of our participants here, Leslie Fleming, is an expert on that network and resource hub. So if you have any questions about that, I know that she can answer it. The network was also there's several people involved, both students and professionals in the kind of horticulture for health arena. So we've been doing this series of network forums just to have an opportunity to kind of come together and talk about things that we're all interested in that relate to this area. And I guess I didn't even introduce myself. My name is Leah Diehl, and I am on the faculty at University of Florida. My responsibilities are to teach the certificate in horticultural therapy. It's a certificate program at University of Florida. I also run a lot of therapeutic horticulture programming here on campus as well for a diverse set of groups. So if you're interested in getting any more information about that, you can let me know. I thought since we're kind of a small group, maybe we could go around and if everybody's comfortable, just maybe introducing themselves, let us know what attracted you to this forum and maybe kind of anything about what you might do. Is everybody comfortable with that?
Sure.
Okay, Leslie, you want to start?
Sure. I've spent a fair amount of my time with the Florida Horticulture for Health Network, and I've been doing a fair amount of research for the website. The salient category for today's forum is the section on landscapes for health, and we've broken it down into different categories. So I'm looking forward to learning from this forum, trying to share some information that we have, although most of the work that I've done you'll see on the resource hub. So hopefully you'll visit the website. And thanks everybody for joining in.
Hi, I'm Wendy, Wendy Doyle. I'm actually joining you from Minnesota. I used to live down in Naples for a couple of years, so I'm familiar with your lovely tropicals that you can grow down there.
Yeah.
I'm just about finished working on my horticultural therapy certification, and I'm actually probably gonna have to leave during your show here because I have to go work at my landscape design job.
Okay.
So I'm just gonna sit back and listen, but I'm tickled when I got the email saying I could join because I'm not in Florida. So teach me.
Great. Well, welcome, Wendy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Susan Morgan. I'm based in the Denver, Colorado area, and I have been doing therapeutic horticulture in public gardens and as a private practitioner in Texas and now Colorado for several years, and went through my Horticultural Therapy Institute HT training there. I'm also involved with the Florida Horticulture for Health Network, and we're always looking for some good volunteers to help out with the network with various capacities, using various people's talents in different ways. So thanks for everybody for joining.
Thanks, Susan. Anybody else want to introduce themselves?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, I'm Jennifer Marks. I live in Indialantic in Brevard County, a little seaside town, and I'm a master gardener for the last 20 plus years. And I have an acre of my own that I think of as a healing garden. And people come here, and especially during COVID, it was a sanctuary for a lot of folks. And I'm very interested in the subject, and I grew up in a family of horticulturalists and healthcare professionals, so the intersection is natural for me. Unfortunately, I am going to have to leave at a certain point Will this be available after?
Yes, we are recording. Hopefully you all got a message that it was being recorded when you signed in, and we will post it on the FLHHN network. So if you
Great.
don't, yeah,
Thank you so much.
sure. Yep. Well, thank you and welcome, Jennifer. Is there anybody else? I don't want to push anybody to introduce themselves, but we'd love to hear from more of you.
Hi, my name is Fran Whitney, and I've been taking some of the therapeutic horticulture courses in at NC State here in North Carolina. And I'm also a master gardener. So I've also been working with therapeutic horticulture at some senior centers. And I found you online, and since it's a topic dear to my heart, I'm enjoying your webinars.
Great. Well, thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay. I'll go ahead and go next. My name is Sherry Larson. I received my HDR in 2018, went through the program at Portland Community College, and I'm not currently working in the field, but it's still my passion, and I wish I was. But, you know, I've got to pay the bills. So anyway, I want to keep up with as much information and training as I can, and hopefully someday in the not too distant future I'll be able to return to that. And I'm glad to be here today.
Good. Thank you, Sherry. We're glad you're here. Anybody else? Okay, well, great. Well, again, thank you for being here. And I just think it's wonderful that we are representing many different states. And the Florida network was based in Florida just because that's kind of where our group was from. But we're definitely, our thoughts are that this is hopefully the network and all the resources it can provide are going to be relevant to anybody, no matter what state you're in, if you're kind of interested in that horticulture for health network, whole arena. So we're glad you're here. And this is going to be an informal kind of forum and talk. And I just thought it would be kind of fun to get an idea of kind of people's thoughts about healing gardens. What make them healing? What are some essential elements? And when we say healing, what are we really thinking about there? You know, are we talking about it being an enabling garden? Are we talking about it being a restorative garden? Does it need to be both? So I don't know if anybody has brought a photo or any kind of information about a garden that they know of, that they think of as healing, that they want to share. I have
Lee?
some. Oh, yep.
Lee, I was just going to share, this is Susan Morgan,
Okay.
and my dogs are just currently going nuts right now. I apologize if there's background noise. I was going to share about a botanical or a public garden on Bainbridge Island in Washington State that I believe is a healing garden called Blodell Reserve. So you might want to look that up. And they, if anybody has ever visited the Pacific Northwest, it's just beautiful, you know, kind of overcast, but you just the lush vegetation that lives there. They have, you might look on their website, a program called Strolls for Wellbeing. And so when I think of a healing space, a healing landscape, that is what they're all about. They actually do have timed entry. I apologize for the dogs. I'm going to quit here in just a minute. They have the Strolls for Wellbeing, and they're set up with timed entry. So to restrict the amount of visitors that can come in because they want to create a certain kind of ambiance at the garden.
That's great. And Susan, that's so interesting because that Strolls for Wellbeing actually originated here in Florida at the, Leslie, what's the name of that garden?
Yeah, Murakami.
Murakami. Thank you. Yeah. And I was so excited to see that it had been worked so well. And for those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's a program. It started with older adults with mild depression where they could stroll through this Murakami garden, which is, Japanese garden in nature. And there were particular pause points, places that they would stop and do some reflective writing. And so they found through a research project that it really did help alleviate depression for older adults and help them to feel more connected. And so they imported that to the garden that Susan, you're talking about. And I don't know if they've done any research on that yet, but it would be great to know if it was having the same effects there. And I do think that it is, you know, when I think about a healing garden, I'm thinking about kind of the overall, like to me, all of these gardens that we think of enabling or restorative kind of fall under that healing umbrella. You know, whether their main purpose is to make things more accessible or their main purpose is just to help you connect with nature. I think those are all different types of healing gardens.
Great. Lee, I have the chart that you put together. I'm going to share my screen. This is Leslie.
Great.
Okay, and so what's going to come up first, and we'll distribute this to all of the participants of the forum. Are you seeing the HTA News magazine? Right.
Yes.
Okay. So this is a publication that several of us were involved in from 2013. The information is still current, and this one garden that you're seeing here is, and I have to read my notes here, it was designed by Virginia Bird, and it's from the Snyder Healing Garden in Seidman Cancer Center, University Hospital in Cleveland, Ohio. And it has a labyrinth. And one of the interesting things I think about this type of garden is that there are views from patient rooms. So not only can you participate in the labyrinth and you can see their seating, and it really is quite beautiful, but I think it's also significant that you can see the patient's views. Now I'm going to scroll down, and hopefully this won't make people sick. Here is a picture of the fractal gate, and it's at the entrance to the Schneider Healing Garden. And she built in different themes representing nature's energy. It was quite pretty. So this is kind of my example, and you can Google this under the name, and well, we're mentioning it here. Okay, close your eyes while I scroll through. Here we go. Okay, so you should now see Lee's framework for landscapes for health, healing gardens. And Lee, this is, I think, what you were referring to, how many of us in hort therapy circles, as well as landscape architecture, think about healing gardens and really the broader umbrella of landscapes for health. And so, you know, they do fall into different categories. So I think through today's discussion, we're probably going to have examples of different types of gardens. Bloedel Garden, I don't know, Susan, would you say that's a sanctuary garden? Or, and some of them don't fall neatly into these categories, although personally, I think this is still fabulous work that you did back in 2013. I think it's still the benchmark for what many of us are using. So,
well, thank you. And one thing I wanted to say is, as I created this, and again, this doesn't mean that this is the way it is. It's just the way I see it. And I wanted to put these ideas out there to be discussed. But the difference between the enabling garden track and the restorative garden track, in my mind, is that in enabling gardens, the primary goal is to make gardening accessible, physically accessible and psychologically accessible for sure. But and then on the restorative tracks, the primary focus and goal of those gardens is to help restore, you know, that kind of taps into the Kaplan stuff about being away and compatibility and that sort of thing. Of course, accessibility is important, but it actually falls below the restoration of your mental health. So both of them, there's a lot of overlap, because as you make gardening more physically accessible, then that's going to help improve people's mental health and vice versa. But that it felt to me like there needed to be this kind of distinction between these. And then again, all the little things that fall under them, demonstration gardens, for example, and I've got an example of one of those to show you, is primarily about demonstrating accessibility aspects. Of course, when you're there and you're participating, you are reaping all those mental health benefits and physical health benefits as well. But from the starting point, that's kind of how those would divide out.
Good. So I'm going to stop sharing unless you want me to leave this up.
No, I think you can stop sharing it. Anybody have any thoughts about that, the concept of that hierarchy?
Very helpful.
Okay, well, great. Well, I would be happy to share. I actually have a few, but I'm just going to start with one. a garden that I think is one of the classic, let's see, actually, just give me just a second. I just realized I need to put it into presentation mode. Okay, I'm afraid this might be sort of on the small side for you. I cannot figure out how to get it off of my small screen, but here we go. So now let me know if you can see this in, are you just seeing the list of pictures here?
We're seeing your slideshow.
Okay.
Okay.
There.
Okay.
Yep.
So this particular example is the enabling garden of the Chicago Botanic Garden. Have any of you ever seen this one or visited it? It
Yeah,
is.
it's fantastic.
It is. It's an amazing garden. I actually had the great fortune. I grew up about a mile away from this garden, and I had the great fortune of living nearby still when they first built this. So although these pictures don't reflect that, I actually have pictures of just the structure. None of these beds had any flowers in them. But one of the reasons that I think this is such an amazing garden is because they have all, first of all, it's beautiful. And there was no, I think it was a $5 million budget that they had. So we clearly can't do this, duplicate this easily in other places, but it's got this sense of being very enclosed. This is the entrance where you come in. And so you really do feel like you're moving into a new zone of the garden. And it does kind of provide that feeling of safety. This picture, I think, is a great picture that shows, actually, I'm going to go to the next one because it's even better, that shows the variety of heights of planting beds that they've created here. So they've got the one on the far left there is one you can really sit on. And actually I've got some pictures, I think, somewhere here of my dad sitting on there. And it's wide enough. It's about a 12-inch width of that top of the edge of the bed. So you can sit and be comfortable. If you want to turn toward the plants and work with them, you can. The one right behind that that's kind of in the middle is a tall one. So you can just stand there. You're not stooping over as you're working at that garden. And then the one on the far right is even in between there. That could, depending on the size of your wheelchair or your stroller or whatever that might be. I also like, sometimes when we think about raised beds, we're thinking about these rectangle boxes that we're really thinking mostly about being accessible. I think one of the things that the Botanic Garden has done so nicely is you can see how they've planted some trees in the back of those raised beds. And so there's a lot of variation of plant material. We're not expected to reach all the way back into the back of that bed. There's no way we could. But that doesn't mean the bed has to be a small, narrow, not very deep bed. You could have more permanent plantings to add to that lushness that Susan mentioned in the garden she talked about, and how, that can really help contribute. So I love that. And that it is kind of hard to tell in this photo, but each of these raised beds, the width of the edge is slightly different. So the really tall one is maybe about 6 inches. Nobody's going to sit on it. So it doesn't need to be wide. And therefore the plants are a little bit closer to you. Here's another example just from kind of a different view. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but this is a water feature back there, and it's actually a water wall. So you can stick your hands in there and make the water do all kinds of different things. It just hits the ground and drains away. When they first designed this, and I have to admit, I haven't been there in a few years, the drain itself wasn't large enough. So water was going everywhere and it was getting slippery. And you can actually see the wet, how it's wet here. So that did kind of cause a problem. And they recognized that they needed to rework those. The other thing I wanted to show you in the background here was that if you can see these vertical planting areas, those are actually vertical boxes. The Chicago Botanic Garden came up with this concept, oh my goodness, way back in the 80s or early 90s. And it's a box that pulls in and out, and you can actually plant it. They do all sorts of, you can do lettuces and herbs, you can do annuals. You can see there's some kind of grasses there. And it's a really cool way to make the planting more vertical without having to create this whole vertical system. You water it from the top and it's just really lush and beautiful. Another example here of one of the raised beds. These are made out of metal, and they're elevated more for somebody using a wheelchair can actually get right under them. I have a picture. I have a little brother who uses a wheelchair. And when this was first being built, I have some pictures of him slid in under there. And you can see there's 3 different heights. You know, we know wheelchairs come in all different sizes these days. So that helps to accommodate as well. A couple more pictures here that I think are interesting. And because this is a demonstration garden, there's signage everywhere that talks about the different details of this garden that help to make it accessible. So they have this whole hanging basket system on pulleys so that somebody that can't reach up can actually lower that into their lap or onto a table or onto their wheelchair tray. And here you can kind of see, here's the hanging basket, and then this is the pulley system underneath. You just open it and crank it down, and that you can kind of see, it's a little bit easier to see here, the system there that's on a pulley to make that more accessible. So you can still have these beautiful plant elements that are up high, even though you can't reach them, there's a way for you easily to get to them to work with them. This was another little feature they included that was kind of neat. It's a grass area, and sorry you can't see that little sign, but it talks about how people that use wheelchairs, walkers, they don't really get the opportunity to sit on the grass. And as we all know, especially when you're younger, how important that is to be able to sit in the grass, especially in the Midwest where we've got Kentucky bluegrass and not the kind of prickly St. Augustine we have in Florida. But this was meant, they created this wall for somebody to transfer themselves on the wall and then scoot themselves onto the grass. So it was kind of like an accessible lawn. It was sort of a neat idea. I've noticed over the years, it's kind of sunk a little bit, you know, as the ground will sometimes do. I think this is the last one I have here, and I don't know if I can make it work, hopefully, but it is a little video that shows you.
It's working.
Okay. It's very short. There's one of those vertical wall gardens right there, and you can see how beautiful it is. But this picture really gives you the sense of the lushness of this garden, which I think is also so critical. I think what is the ratio? I want to say it's something like, they say for a healing garden, 7:2 nature to hardscape is kind of the what you want for a healing garden.
That's interesting. I'd like to share, Lee, if I can, the Naples Botanical Gardens Enabling Garden was based on the Buehler Enabling Garden at the Chicago Botanic Garden, which you've just shown. Now, Donna, I saw in chat that you just visited the Chicago Botanic Garden. Is it's still called the Buehler Enabling Garden, or have they changed the name?
I believe it's the same name. It was a huge garden to kind of explore, and we were exploring right before, it was right after the conference, the ASHS. And so we were exploring right before our flight. So unfortunately, I did not get to see that portion of the botanical garden, but it was just so amazing. So many different areas and variety, and I definitely highly recommend.
Yeah, I would too. I would say the Japanese garden within Chicago Botanical Gardens is a beautiful, I would put it in the category restorative garden. When we were there, and Lee and I were there together for a conference, an AHTA conference many years ago, I found that a real stress buster. It was a gorgeous garden just with its lushness, but also in terms of restoring my mental capacity.
And one more thing, Leslie, if do you have some pictures you're going to pull up of the Buehler Enabling Garden?
I guess I could, but that's.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you're just going to share that it was the verbally share.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, good. And I just wanted to mention about they're the Buehlers from the Chicago Botanic Garden, the Naples Botanic Garden are related. And we actually did a video down at the Buehler Enabling Garden in Naples a few years ago, and it's a very different feel than this one, but it's also a beautiful garden, has a beautiful view of water, and is really a neat example. One of the things that's neat about the Chicago Botanic Garden Enabling Garden is that they've got some water features. I showed you the water wall, but there's also kind of a central fountain, and they've made the water warm. So they've actually heated the water. And when everybody always dips their fingers in the water to kind of see how it feels, it's actually warm, and it catches you off guard a little bit, but I think it almost immediately makes you focus more on what's going on, because that sensory connection I think is so important.
Right. I do have some photos if people want to see the Naples Buehler Enabling Garden.
Sure.
Okay. And I see that I need to have the host allow me to screen share. Okay. Yep. Okay. Okay, my photos are kind of small too. Are you seeing these? So this is one of the raised planter boxes. And I think one of the developments with techniques of adaptive gardening, if you look at the very bottom, you can see there's an indent. That's a toe hold, which allows you to stand at this higher bed without stooping. Some volunteers, seating. For these types of gardens, they recommend having arms for the chairs so people can push off of it. They want furniture to be stable. These were some participants, some young people using the garden. A bit of a trellis. Like the Chicago Enabling Garden, the beds were at different heights. Some of them you could sit on the ledge, Lee, as you mentioned, others not so much. This one has a little bit of a ledge, but I think now the theory is that that's very difficult for most people because you have to twist your torso. And so that's not really that great a, position. They had a potting bench. I think this is pretty standard in a lot of gardens that we're using for HT or TH. Again, plants at different heights. This gives a bit of shade, but not really that much in the Florida sun. They have this covered cheeky hut, they call it, which is based on indigenous people's traditions. And that provided some shade and some tables so that programs could be delivered there. A variety of plants. So part of the garden. So, okay, so I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Leslie. Those are good photos. And, as you were showing those, it makes me, I have a question for all of you. So I showed you the Chicago Botanic Garden, which is in the Midwest and certainly represents a lot of the plant material from the Midwest. And then Leslie just showed you the one from Naples, very different plant palette. How important do you all think it is for a healing garden to reflect the plant culture, for lack of a better term, of that area? Do you think it's more healing for people to be immersed in the plants they're familiar with? Or do you think it could be more or just as healing for them to be immersed in plants that are, say, tropical when they're not used to that? Do you have any thoughts about that, anybody?
I think that both are very important. I was in the Peace Corps when it first started in 1961, and on leave I went to Japan, which was a completely new environment for me. And I found myself profoundly moved and comforted by Zen gardens. And that it was and the images are still with me so very clear, and I'm 82. So, and then it's also wonderful to be with the landscape of one's childhood is probably the landscape of one's heart. So very comforting to be surrounded by familiar plants with the texture, the smell, the way the light comes through them. There's that wonderful Japanese word komorebi, which means the quality of light of sun filtering through leaves, which is important. So I think both are.
Yeah, I love that. I think you're right. And what I'm hearing you say is in part being exposed to a type of plant or a type of garden that you've not seen before really can give you a different perspective of the ways nature heals. We may be used to one kind, but not realizing that, and whether they heal in different ways, who knows? But that's very interesting. Yeah. Anybody else have any thoughts about that?
I think if we're using different gardens, delivering horticultural therapy or any plant programming, it's going to be the different populations or individuals that we're working with are going to respond to different plants. And I remember one of the programs that I did at a county jail, I asked the participants, incarcerated men, to choose a plant that spoke to them. And, you know, the ones that they chose were very different than what I would have chosen that resonated with me. And I think we see that when we go to different gardens. So different populations are looking for a Zen garden experience. I'm doing a fair amount of research right now on food insecurity and food insecure populations. And so they're very much interested in edible plants. And, you know, then I think about some plants like succulents or cactus, which to me are pretty harsh. They're not my favorite, but they speak to people who really like the architectural look, and different gardens are going to highlight different types of plants. So yeah, I kind of go with the variety. And I have to say, most people first are enamored by color, plant color, including green. And so, you know, sometimes we want that always to be part of the garden, but I think there can be other elements within gardens as well.
Well, and there's also, you know, all the theory about the color of flowers relaxing you, energizing you. And so I think it's important for us to have a sense of that as we're designing or planting some of these gardens. Is, are we trying to create this place as a more calming, soothing garden, in which case we might want to be thinking about the blues and the greens, or are we trying to really help build, you know, help people to get energized, in which case oftentimes it's the reds and the yellows. So any other thoughts about plant types or colors?
I think texture is really important, and sort of mass, you know, again, the architecture of the garden, just speaking of the plant material, and color, for example, if there's a garden that is going to be seen in the evening as well as in the daytime, you know, with lighter colors farther away, white, for example, at dusk, you know, say a moon garden or something. I mean, there's so many possibilities.
There are. It's exciting and overwhelming.
Yeah.
How many possibilities there can be.
Yeah, both. I'd like to share that Evie, who is part of the Florida Horticulture for Network, and I are doing some research right now on hospital gardens, actually horticulture for health activity in U.S. hospitals. And we're hoping that the work will be published by the end of the year in the Journal of Therapeutic Horticulture. And so one of the Hort for Health activities is gardens in hospitals. And what has struck us is just the number of hospitals that actually have gardens. And for those of us who've read Naomi Sachs and Claire Cooper Marcus's book on evidence-based blah, 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 whatever the rest of that book title is, we know that a lot of gardens and hospitals are designed smartly to address health needs of hospital patients. And this can be by population, although it would include visitors to the various hospitals and their families. And it is interesting to see that these healing gardens, and again, they fall across that whole framework spectrum of Lee, your framework, that there is such a variety. And even though I've been looking at this for a number of years, I'm still inspired and overwhelmed. One of the children's hospital gardens has an activity canyon. Another one that's very famous is the St. Louis Children's Hospital that has that magnificent rooftop outdoor play garden. Then there are a lot of hospitals for veterans and military personnel, and they are having gardens that are designed a little bit differently. One of them, and I think it's in Bethesda, has a path, and I think they call it the morning path, so that people can decompress and think about fellow service people who have passed away in service to the country. And so that's more of a nature trail. So one of the things that has struck us about these gardens at hospitals is that they are addressing needs of the different patients, and that they can be quite different. Of course, there are commonalities, including what we've touched on already: colors, texture. You know, they want to be fully accessible, but it really is quite interesting to see the nature of these gardens. And to date, we've listed, I think, over 100. Many of them are therapeutic gardens. Many of them are not used for therapeutic interventions, but, you know, I think many hospitals in the US and throughout the world have gardens. So that's a whole different subset of healing gardens that we could talk forever on.
Well, Leslie, that was actually a great segue for, I have a couple other photos of another garden, which is a hospital garden. If you all are interested, can share that. Let's see here. This is, you see that? The Howard Ulfelder Healing Garden.
Yep, it's on a slideshow.
Yeah, Boston. Yeah. So you can see it's a rooftop garden. It's right here in the middle there. That obviously must have been a fall picture taken in the fall. I did not take this picture myself, but it's a very small garden and it is a hospital garden. But in my opinion, this really falls into the contemplative garden category. And let's see, here is a picture of it. There we go. And I'll tell you why I think it's contemplative. So it would be, in my framework, it would be under the restorative garden track. There's not gardening happening here. This is a place to sit, to be part of nature, to observe. And when I think about the difference between a meditation garden, and a contemplation garden, I'm thinking that in a meditation garden, you're really kind of looking within. The views are more smaller, more, I don't want to say shallow, that sounds negative, but views more within, because you're really thinking about the things within yourself. And so the design of the garden should reflect enclosure and spatial planes and that sort of thing. I believe that when you're talking about a contemplative garden, when we're contemplating, we're often thinking about things beyond ourselves, the greater existence, however you might want to say that. And so I believe the design of those kinds of gardens should be much more outward. They should be longer views, farther reaching. And that's really what I think this garden does. So what we're standing in the garden looking back at the building right now, and they have this beautiful glass atrium. This is Boston, so people can't be out here all the time, especially on the 8th floor. But that's a very lush atrium that allows them to look out. And you can see some nice seating here. But this is the view. So the atrium is kind of on our left over here. And you can see on the right, there's a glass parapet that is the edge of the building. And so although you've got this beautiful garden, there's this neat kind of flat water feature there, really, because there's no obstruction to your view. You're looking way beyond this garden and out actually to the Charles River. Let's see if I've got a better picture of it here. Yeah, you can kind of see through here. So this is the sitting area, and you can see there's this kind of cool tower that's part of the building, and then you can see way out to the water. So you're encouraged to look far out and kind of, I don't know, I always think about feeling in the hospital setting, maybe realizing that, you know, the world is a big place, nature's a big place. Sometimes when we realize that we're just one part of the whole world, that actually can be cool in some ways. And then you can see on the right there a picture of being in that atrium, so you still have those amazing views. So again, this is a hospital garden that is, maybe that's the last picture I have, not about doing so much as it is about being. And to me, it's a very different type of healing garden than the example of the Chicago Botanic Garden that I showed you. There's a lot of overlap in terms of being dominated by nature and plants and that sort of thing, but the focus is really very different. Any thoughts about that?
Agree.
Does anybody, did anybody bring along a photo that they might want to share with us?
I hadn't thought of that.
Just want to make sure everybody has a chance to share if they have any thoughts or anything they want to share with us.
Right, and maybe I can just share that I put in the chat box most of the title of the Claire Cooper Marcus Naomi Sachs book on therapeutic landscapes and evidence-based approach to designing healing gardens and restorative outdoor spaces. And I really think this is a seminal book for people who are interested in this topic. So I didn't mean to take up space, but I do think that that's an important book for people to see.
Yep, I agree. You know, another concept that I always think about when I'm thinking about healing gardens, and Susan Morgan and I have had kind of this conversation. She wrote a really wonderful chapter in one of the horticultural therapy textbooks. And I think that we always think about accessibility when we're thinking about healing gardens, and we're always thinking about physical accessibility. How do we make gardening accessible? Raised beds, flat surfaces. You know, I showed you the hanging baskets. But I think there's also this very critical component of psychological accessibility that we always need to consider in a healing garden. And what I mean by that is, are we making this garden, are we designing it in such a way that people want to go out into the garden, that they feel comfortable being out in the garden? You can imagine somebody that might be in a hospital setting. They may love the idea of the garden, but they're afraid because what if they need to go to the bathroom when they're out there? Or what if there's not a place for them to sit? Or what if there's no shade? And they may make the decision ahead of time that it's too much for me to be out there because they don't know what's out there, and how that, you know, that kind of be able to break through that psychological fear. So I think it's really important that from the entrance of the garden, people can see some idea of what's out there. They can see a bench in the shade, that, you know, they can actually physically see it, so they know that's the next place I can get to. Or that there's something interesting, making an interesting sound out there, or there's some kind of interesting view that's going to draw people into the garden. You could have the most beautiful garden in the world, but if it doesn't have some of those components, it can be difficult for everybody to be able to navigate it from a psychological standpoint.
I
Any
agree.
thoughts about that? I was going to say, does anybody agree, disagree?
I was curious if I put in the chat, but if sensory elements in healing gardens had already been discussed. And if not, if anybody had found any favorite spaces that they had seen that really emphasized different sensory elements, thoughts on prioritizing certain senses over others for certain populations, things like that.
We haven't talked about that in depth. We've mentioned the sensory qualities a little bit, but and there are some amazing sensory gardens out there that are designed specifically as sensory gardens. I'm aware of one in Grand Rapids, Michigan at the, oh gosh, I'm going to forget the name. It's actually a sculpture garden out there, but they have an amazing sensory garden that's broken up into quadrants. One is the sense of hearing, one is the sense of smell, and everything from the plants to the hardscape to the sculptures are related to that. And of course, there's the Coastal Maine Botanic Garden, the Lerner Sensory Garden, that's also amazing, a much larger garden that again divides the garden up into different parts based on the senses. Anybody know of any others?
Well, I've been to a sensory garden at a Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario winery. So I guess that would be for wellness populations more than others. But, you know, it was interesting because people responded to that. I mean, many of us in the HT field, we think about stimulating senses for seniors populations that we work with. And, you know, that's very tactile touch. But I think, you know, there's more than just sense of touch, sensory, you know, stimulation. So yeah, that's kind of, I think it would be considered a healing garden and you could imbibe at the same time. I'm not recommending that, but I was surprised to see it in that setting. So
what do people think about some of the more important senses in the garden? Do you feel like it's important that all types of sensory stimulation are available, or do you think there's just a couple that are most important?
I think they're all important. Shall I go ahead?
Sure.
I mean, imagine the difference between driving through a beautiful landscape in a car with the air conditioning on and the windows up, and then walking when you can feel the movement of the air, and the smells, and because you're slower and taking time, the light, the moisture in the air or lack of it. I think it's important to appeal to all the senses. And when you walk on a mint bed, for example, or you walk past a rosemary hedge, it's suddenly, wow, you go from 0 to 60 in a fraction of a second.
I guess one of the questions that I have is, or at least what I try to keep at the forefront, I haven't only designed one garden in my time, a community garden, and it was very DIY. And so a big focus was trying to make it very accessible in terms of affordability. And so when I think of these sensory gardens, I guess if you had to prioritize certain senses over the others, I would like to include all of them, but if you had to, I guess which ones would they be, and why would that be the most important?
At the beginning of this presentation, I shared a AHTA news magazine that was published with the theme of therapeutic gardens, and we'll distribute this to everybody that's participating. And one of the articles that's in this magazine was written by Susan Morgan, who's participating. Susan, you probably don't even necessarily remember doing this article, but Daniela, it's Fragrant Plants for Horticultural Therapy Programs, and it has wonderful photos and examples of how we can use them. And Susan, are you recalling this at all? I have it pulled up in front of me. You had recommended scented geraniums, lemongrass, pine from pine trees, gardenias. I'm just kind of going through this: lavender, rosemary, paper whites, citrus. So I think those are some that we often think about, and we use them in different gardens, but also for programming purposes.
Yes, and I've since updated kind of a version of that article. I'll go through and see if I can find that to share before we end today's session. But just some of my favorite plants to include for sensory stimulation in various gardens that I program for different reasons, but for all the different sensory aspects of them. So I'll go through and see if I can find that. I had forgotten about that article. Thank you for reminding me.
It was very well written. Your updated one is probably on, and I'd recommend this site, Eat, Breathe, Garden. That has Eat, Breathe, Garden. Maybe Susan, you can put up the link to that. You've got lots of wonderful information, including sensory programs, sensory plants.
Yeah, I put in the chat the two gardens, sensory gardens I was thinking of. It was the Meyer Gardens in Grand Rapids, and then the Lerner Garden in Maine. Those are really wonderful examples of sensory gardens. And, one of the things that I often try to challenge myself, and full disclosure here, it's been a little while since I've actually designed a garden, but as a landscape architect, very interested in the concept of healing and experiential learning, I often, in the right context, would challenge myself to try to find ways to make other sensory elements reproducible in a garden. So for example, there's lots of different plants we can use for the fragrance, and that's so important. There's a lot of different plants we can use for the colors and the texture, and again, that's so important. But what about some of those less tangible aspects of nature that are also very sensory oriented, things like wind or sound in the garden, or temperature and experiencing the change of temperature? Are there ways that we can design those experiences into a garden? Actually the Lerner Garden that I've put there, they have one of those really cool sound stones where that's just the gigantic stone and you stick your head in and it sounds very different inside there than it does outside. But are there ways that we can plant? Leslie, I think, was one of the people that, kind of taught me about how ornamental grasses actually can make this beautiful sound if you plant them in the right place. Bamboo, if you're, live in a place where we can grow bamboo, when it moves, it clicks. It makes this really neat sound. And so are there things that we can do that are a little bit less straightforward to really help deepen somebody's engagement in a garden. Just a thought.
Yeah, well, and I think you bring up an interesting point, Lee, that sometimes we are in a garden passively and we want to hear the bamboo rustling. Selby Botanical Gardens in Sarasota, Florida, which is close to where I live, they have these one or two gongs. One is at the koi pond. And so as you're walking past, that's a more active engagement in a garden where you hit the gong. And they have another cement formed cavern that you, and this sounds weird, you stick your head in, but the sound resonates. So again, that's another active experience that you can have in a garden. So I think that to your point, Lee, you know, do we need to think about how we can recreate or offer these different opportunities? Thinking back to hospital gardens with children, and not just for children patients, but, you know, they want to be active. And so their gardens, they have things that you climb on, things that you touch. Some of them are hardscapes, some of them are plantscapes. It's all in a plant-rich environment. And so, yeah, I think that it can be quite interesting to think of it in those terms. Now, back to this magazine, the HTA News magazine that we're going to distribute. One of the other articles is on children's gardens. And Susan, again, you were involved in working with the author of this one, and it's distilling the essence of children's garden design. And this talks more about active experiences in gardens. And so if we think of children's gardens, maybe at public garden settings, and there has been a trend to include children's gardens, you know, would I necessarily describe them immediately as a healing garden? I don't know. I would think about that. But in fact, now that I know more than 2013 when this issue was published, I would say yes. And again, there's different elements to healing. One of them is, and certainly living through COVID, or with COVID still around, we need stress reduction. One of it is, you know, trying to improve the functionality or well-being of families. And so experiencing gardens with children or as a family unit, that can be healing. That can address some issues that may be more psychological or cultural than, say, physically challenging. So, you know, again, I think when we hear about these different gardens, we can kind of take a different spin on our perspective. So what I'm hearing is very interesting, certainly different than how I'm often thinking about gardens. So thank you, everybody, for sharing.
I just put in the chat, if you're not familiar with this, the Therapeutic Landscapes Network, which is an amazing resource on everything to do with the concept of healing gardens and landscapes. It's Naomi Sachs put this together, and it's been going on for years. She's got these great blogs. So I really highly recommend you taking a look at that if you're not familiar with it. We only have a few minutes left. Is there anybody that has been quiet so far that wants to say anything, mention anything, ask any questions? No pressure, just want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to talk if they wanted to.
So I wanted to say about, if I am developing a garden in my area, which I am in my backyard, and I have some things already finished, but there are other things that getting input. I mean, I can get ideas, but it would be kind of nice to put it out there. Like, what do you think? What do you think I ought to put out here? Just to hear, you know, input from other people.
That's a great question. And I don't know that I know an answer to that. If we have, you know, one of the things we've been talking about with Florida Horticulture for Health Network is having some kind of forum, you know, sort of ongoing through social media where people could put out questions like that and get a lot of responses. Or any of else of you familiar with any kind of a sort of garden advice or design advice type Facebook page or anything like that?
Well, I think for sure go to the Florida Horticulture for Health Network social media Facebook page, and Susan is coordinating this for us. So I think that would be a forum. One option that we have, if people are interested, this can be part one of this networking forum focused on healing gardens. And if there's interest, we can explore, you know, having ongoing discussions. One of the things that I'll consider, being the editor of the Cultivate e-publication for the Florida Network, is trying to pull together some ideas from today and writing up an article. The other thing that we've done in previous forums on different topics through this network is to try to connect people. So, you know, if there are some people who have specific questions, like the one that was just presented, you know, you would have the contact information. That requires us to ask that we can share people's emails. So Cassandra, that might be a possibility as well. So if people are interested in that, either subsequent forums or discussion groups on healing gardens or specific questions, the easiest way to communicate that to the Florida Network is to send an email to us, and then we'll try and follow up on that. Or I would say, for those of us participating, if you have any suggestions for Cassandra, you know, again, you can relay them through our email or, you know, send them to Cassandra. But I do think you raise an interesting point, Cassandra, is that many of the examples that I've certainly given today are institutional gardens. And I think, again, with COVID, there has been a recentering on healing therapeutic gardens on the personal level, how we as individuals can set up our own personal gardens. You know, as horticultural therapists, we're thinking about the gardens that we're using for programming, but I think that this continues to rise in importance, and it is really, really important elements of healing gardens as well. How do we care for ourselves, sometimes called self-care? So thanks for sharing that point.
Yeah, and we have kind of come to the end of the hour. This has been really great for me. I've loved hearing, you know, people's thoughts and experiences, and those of you that were able to share some gardens both visually and verbally. It's good to know about those. So I really appreciate you guys spending time with us. I just want to remind everybody that this forum was sponsored by the Florida Horticulture for Health Network. It's a free resource. It's really growing, and I think the more people that kind of subscribe, which doesn't mean you have to pay anything. It just means that you're, you know, you kind of get some of our materials, get our newsletter, all that sort of stuff. I think the more we have, the more we probably can develop some of these avenues that Cassandra was asking about, which would be really great. And again, no need to be in Florida, no need to even be in the United States. Mateus, I see you there. He's here all the way from Brazil. So it would, you know, it's great. It's just that that's where it started. But I think that we have some resources there and can come together from really all over the world, which really is, in my mind, one of the best solutions. So thank you so much.
And Lee, I'm going to pull up the page from the Florida Horticulture for Health Network's resource hub, and you'll see that there is a category, Landscapes for Health, Designed Landscapes. So if you go to the website, you can click on these, and we've pulled together resources. So thanks for sharing those. And, you know, hopefully these will help people understand the different types of landscapes for health, including the ones that we've touched on today.
Great. I see it spinning.
Oh.
But it's not, it doesn't seem to have loaded.
Okay. You know
so,
what?
But let's see, I will put in, Leslie, do you mind putting in oh, there you go. You got it.
Yep. Okay.
Good. So you can see these are some of the different kinds of categories we have for all sorts of really great resources.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you everybody so much. I appreciate you being here, and hopefully we will see you again in another webinar or forum. Thank you.
Thank you so much.